As a lot of you guys already know, especially if you've been following me for the past couple weeks, I had a very exciting start to this year's competitive Yu-Gi-Oh season. I went with Altergeist to the UDS Invitational, which is one of the hardest events of the year. There's 2 of them and you have to have a lot of points to enter, and it's against some very challenging players, and I managed to make top 4 at that event. My first premier top ever. I've had some regional tops, I've had a couple ARG tops, but that was like the first big top, and it was with Altergeist, a very rogue strategy a lot of people didn't even think was good anymore once Multifaker went to 1, and a deck that I'm a huge fan of, a deck I've been playing for over a year at that point, and I really enjoyed that event. And while that was very exciting, what was more exciting was that the next weekend in Portland at the YCS, I managed to get that top as well. I made top 82, so not as far as the UDS, but getting 2 back-to-back premier tops with my favorite rogue strategy in the game was really exciting. And I noticed that when you guys were commenting, I just got so many supportive comments, but I also got a lot of questions. Over the next couple days, I'm going to make 2 different videos. The first one is going to focus on rogue decks entirely, just generally, which is what this one is. The second one is going to focus on playing a deck based around trap cards in 2019, when, to be completely honest, trap cards aren't very popular. And I'm doing this because a lot of people have been asking questions about, well, how can you be successful with a rogue deck? How do you go off meta? And I think there are some hard truths about this that I've maybe mentioned in past videos, but I want to put it all in one place. And while it is true that you're allowed to play whatever deck you want at an event as long as it's legal and you're following the ban list or whatever, I'm looking at rogue decks in today's video from a competitive standpoint. So if you're someone that is playing competitively, you're trying to get that first invite or that first premier top, this is a video for you. And there might be some hard truths that will be difficult to sort of digest when you first hear them, but hear me out, because I love playing rogue decks. But the first big hard truth that you guys need to understand is that if you're trying to be competitive and you're trying to be successful in Yu-Gi-Oh or any card game, you have to really keep in mind, when it comes down to it, playing a rogue deck won't get you any real brownie points. It might get you brownie points with your subscribers or the people that comment on your videos, but if you're playing a deck only because it's rogue and because it's not meta, that's not a good enough reason. This is the difference between just a random person playing like Blackwings at a regional not doing very well, and someone taking a dedicated rogue strategy that they feel has a good matchup against the meta and being successful. And I can't stress enough that that Blackwing player isn't doing anything wrong. If they like Blackwings, if they want to play Blackwings, that's perfectly fine, but they then can't turn around and complain that they're not doing very well just because they wanted to play Blackwings. You can play whatever you want to play, but that doesn't mean it's going to be successful, and in many cases, if you don't put in the time and effort to actually look at the metagame and see if your deck has a good matchup, you won't actually have that fun at the regional if your goal was being as successful as possible. If your goal was just to resolve Blackwing monsters, then yeah, you're probably going to have a great time, but that's sort of where you have to do a goal evaluation before you enter a tournament. Are you trying to have fun at the lower tables against the non-meta decks? Well, then just play whatever. But if you're trying to actually be successful and win as many rounds as possible to get that invite, to get that top, to get that win, you have to look at the meta, you have to look at your deck, you have to look at the cards in your deck, your tech choices, and you have to ask yourself, is this truly the best of the best in terms of my available cards? Because if it's not, you really have to have a good reason to defend yourself, because if you're trying to be successful at a tournament but you're not playing the best cards, the best deck you have available, you're kind of just making it harder on yourself. I know it's going to sound crazy, but when I went to the UDS, I tested a ton of decks before that, pretty much every single deck, Thunder Dragons, Orcus, Sky Strikers, Salamangreats, and after playing all those decks, I realized that those decks wouldn't give me the highest chance of topping, the highest chance of winning, and that led me to Altergeist. I know that sounds weird because people are just like, well, of course you're going to go back to Altergeist, you love that deck, and while that is true, I also know the deck has huge shortcomings. Whenever you're looking at a rogue strategy compared to the meta decks, you're going to lose something, right? Because in general, when I talk about meta decks, you sort of consider that they're all going to be consistent and versatile and powerful, and there's certainly going to be those things to different levels depending on which deck you're talking about, but when you switch to a rogue deck, it's almost always going to be missing one of those 3 things, and there's certainly other ways to analyze a deck, but if we look at something like Altergeist, you're losing a lot of power, right? It's not very good going second, it can't really break boards too often, you're losing a little bit of consistency compared to other decks, you certainly have consistency cards, but in general, an Orcus deck is almost always going to be able to summon Nightmare Mermaid turn 1 and do their full combo. It's up to their opponent to either break their board or stop it from getting made, but in a deck like Altergeist, even when you go first, sometimes you just don't draw any monster cards, sometimes you draw too many monster cards. That's just something that you have to know you're getting into when you're playing a deck that's not a meta strategy. But despite all of this, I still took Altergeist to the UDS, and I sort of took them thinking, okay, if this sort of crashes and burns, I'll just switch to something else for the YCS, but it didn't, because I made a meta call, and I made a meta call with many of my tech choices and all the things in my side deck, and I said that I think Altergeist have a really good matchup against combo decks, and I think combo decks are going to be very prevalent at the UDS, and lo and behold, they were, and I faced so many combo decks throughout that tournament, and I just destroyed most of them up until like exactly top 4, and that's what I expected to play against, and that's how I built my deck, and how I expected to actually beat people was just play against combo decks, draw trap cards, draw hand traps, etc, etc. If it was a different format, if the ban list was different, I maybe wouldn't have played Altergeist, but I did a meta analysis and looked at my own deck and the cards in it and said, I think this has a good enough matchup against the expected metagame that I'm confident this can actually get me to the top cut, and it did. Which leads me to my next hard truth, which admittedly I think is really tough for a lot of players, and I think this is where a lot of rogue players really fall short, and that's that to play a rogue deck, you need to know how to play the meta decks, how to play against the meta decks. I can't tell you the amount of time that I've talked to people that are playing rogue decks at event that expect to do well, even though their deck isn't well equipped against the meta, and even though they don't even know what the meta cards do. Sure, you know on paper like what the ending boards look like, but you need to know at all levels, every single point of all of their combos, every single possible opening of their cards, you need to know what to stop, what is most impactful. I think that's a huge deal that a lot of rogue duelists miss. They figure, like, I don't want to play a meta deck, so why would I play one when I'm just trying to play a rogue deck? But to be successful with a rogue deck, you need to know the meta decks, maybe even better than your opponents do that are playing those strategies. This is definitely something that I attribute my 2 tops with Altergeist too, because one of the things that I know with Altergeist is what I can do in any given turn. I know how many negations I have, how many interruptions I have, but I need to know what my opponent can actually accomplish with their cards so that I know what to stop. I'll talk about that more in the next video, talking about trap cards specifically, but just realize no matter what rogue deck you're playing, you need to know what the meta can do so you know how to prepare to fight against it. Where this gets really difficult, and something that is very common, is that if your entire playtesting group, all of your friends only own rogue strategies, well, sure, they get to test against those other rogue decks, and they maybe get to see like some of the consistency issues with their own deck, and they can change a few things, they can test some of their combos, but they don't get the full experience of testing because they're not playing against the expected metagame. If I test like Phantom Knight Amazoness, which is a deck that I really liked casually, if I test that against like Harpies, yeah, maybe I win like 9 out of 10 games. I'm just like, holy crap, this deck is insane. But then I play against Strikers at a regional and I lose every single round because I sort of was built up with the false confidence because I played against a rogue deck and just beat it so easily. So then people go, well, what if I just go on Yu-Gi-Oh! Pro and I play against Strikers, I play against Orcus and what have you, and I beat those guys pretty consistently. Why am I not beating them at real tournaments? Well, there's a huge difference between any online dueling simulator and actually going to an event. I've talked about this many a time, but I'll talk about it briefly here. People just don't care as much when they play online. You know, there's no stakes, they don't have to spend any money, so they just play random builds, they don't have to travel anywhere. All those things that I know can be frustrating for a budget player to deal with, those are the things that make people actually care about playing well, actually going to events, driving the 3 hours in the morning, waking up at the crack of dawn, and spending all that time, spending all that money, spending the testing time to actually play whatever deck they want to play. They care a lot when they go to those events and actually play those strategies, so they're going to try to beat you as much as they can, and it's a best 2 out of 3, versus like someone on Yu-Gi-Oh! Pro who just is on their lunch break, maybe playing some striker lists that they saw a couple weeks ago. They're not going to care nearly as much. So yeah, you might beat them in that one game or maybe even a couple games, but they're probably not giving it their all, so those wins, while they do kind of count, they don't really count in the grand scheme of how you actually should be testing. So then you might be thinking, well, what is he saying? Am I saying that all of your friends should just switch to meta decks so you have something to test against? And the answer is no. I know that people aren't going to do that. I'm not asking you to do that, but if you are in a friend group like what I just described, which I myself have been part of many a times, you have to go out of your way to find a way to actually play against meta decks in real life, hopefully in a tournament situation. Whether or not that means going to a locals or maybe going to a regionals and sort of realizing that you're not well equipped against the meta decks, but at least you can get some testing in, whatever it happens to be. Maybe if you go to a local tournament and you meet someone with a meta deck, maybe you don't just play them in the locals, you ask them to play maybe before or after a couple more games, a couple more matches to really test some tech options or test your matchup so you're actually well equipped when you go to the real event, whatever event you're truly testing for. And certainly if you can't go to locals and if you can't play against meta decks, I'm not saying you'll never win against them at a regional. You might even get that invite, you might even get that top, but it's going to be a lot harder than someone that actually spent the time to prepare against the expected metagame. That's just how this goes. When I've talked about Magic Cylinder, which I mentioned in a bunch of videos at this point, what I constantly bring up is that Magic Cylinder will win you a couple games. It'll win you some games. I'm not denying that, but it's not the highest percentage card that you can put in almost any deck available. The same thing goes for testing. If you go to an event and you haven't tested at all, you can win some games against the meta decks even, but you're not going to win the highest percentage possible. And if you're someone that's trying to take it seriously, well, then you have to put in the time. You have to put in the energy to actually playtest against the expected decks. Otherwise, you can't really complain too much. You know, so often I hear people and I talk to people, friends and stuff from locals that say things like, well, I didn't test this event, but man, I just got sacked every round, so it didn't matter. And it's like, maybe that happened, maybe they got sacked every round, but probably more often than not, they just made a poor metagame choice, or they misplayed and they just didn't realize it. And that is definitely a hard thing to realize, especially when no one's just watching every motion of your duel. And realize this is coming from someone, me, who used to do this all the time. I would constantly just play the worst deck, and it was so bad, terrible list, terrible strategy, and I would just complain round after round after round that my opponent sacked me, or I drew bad, or my opponent drew insane, whatever. But then later on, I eventually realized, holy crap, all of my lists were terrible. Like, none of them had any redeeming qualities. That's probably why I was losing so many rounds, but in the moment, I just didn't realize it. But what it comes down to, and I can say this now that I'm sort of detached from those past tournaments where all I did was just complain after round after round after round, is that I can say is that you're only really harming yourself. I mean, yeah, your friends, I mean, maybe you're saying, you're trying to sound a little bit cooler, right? You're like, oh, we got sacked, instead of just saying like you misplayed, but that only really hurts yourself in the long run because you're not learning to address your mistakes. A lot of times when I do deck profiles on my channel, especially at tournaments where I didn't do so well, like the last weekend tournament in Rosemont at the regional, people will say things like, well, why is he making an excuse for every single loss that he had? Why can't he just admit that he's worse than his opponents? And it's like, even if I am worse than my opponents, because it certainly happens from time to time, I'm not nearly like a top tier player, I'm not the best player in the game, it's important to address my mistakes, especially on camera, so that I can learn from them, so that you guys can learn from them. Especially if it was like a ruling or a really glaring misplay, I want you guys to hear about it, I want myself to acknowledge it, so that both of us can sort of grow as we go to more and more tournaments and sort of have a back and forth learning experience. I know it sounds kind of corny, but it really is what I'm trying to do when I talk about my mistakes in my deck profiles. That's probably all I have to say about this topic, but make sure to stay tuned in the next couple days here. I'll have a video about how to play a trap deck in 2019 when there's so many outs to trap cards. It certainly will be beneficial to anyone playing any deck, but I think specifically to people that are playing trap decks like Guru Control or True Draco or Altergeist, that's really what it's going to focus on, how to actually use trap cards when there's so many cards that counter them right now. I'll see you guys later though. Thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.